My name's Becky Shepherd. I am a first-year PhD student in the Department of Environment and Geography at the University of York. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to you all, and thank you for my two fellow presenters for their wonderful talks before. So I want to talk to you about, it's entitled Investigating the Integration of Formal and Informal Decision-Making Spaces for Producing Gender-Responsive Climate Adaptation Policy. And I'm going to preempt this by saying this is very much a work in progress. It is very much a proposal for my research at this stage, but I just want to set out really the context at a pretty high level and talk about the aims and objectives for this piece of research. Okay. So really I want to talk about first from a context perspective why gender-effective climate adaptation strategies are so important. And I think we're all probably aware of this, but I really want to frame it in this way to start with. We're all aware climate change is causing a rise in global temperatures and an increase in extreme weather events. And the Global South is generally bearing the brunt of these, despite historically and currently emitting lower levels of greenhouse gases. Development factors compound climatic events, which can increase vulnerability, and these are context-specific. Now, the IPCC latest assessment report has recognised this and has flagged that urban areas within the Global South are particularly at risk from climatic impacts, and they specifically refer to the fact that these effects are predominantly concentrated on what they call economically and socially marginalised urban residents. And it's evident across the Global South, not everywhere, but in several instances, that low-income urban settlements are growing in areas that are high risk of climate change. So low-lying areas on floodplains, areas at risk of wildfires, for example. And this is often due to lower land costs, proximity to business districts for work, and just generally lower costs of living. And in these kind of low-income settlements, in these high-risk areas, you very much have a scenario where social vulnerability and climate risks intersect, which makes these sort of compounds the existing vulnerabilities that are faced by settlement dwellers. Now, my research focuses very much on informal settlements, and where you have a settlement that's classified as informal, these vulnerabilities can be further compounded. And by informal settlements, I want to use David Satterthwaite's definition of kind of these settlements that develop outside the formal legal systems for land ownership, for use, planning, health and safety, etc. And by their very nature, these have specific challenges. Their informal status means that they're often outside the formal administrative boundaries of urban centres, and it can mean, in particular, one of the main challenges is a lack of services and infrastructure to these settlements. From a climate change perspective, where you have things like a lack of drainage or stormwater drainage in particular, if you have an urban area particularly that's experiencing intense rainfall, there's less drainage, there's more chance of flooding. Also, the floodwaters take longer to drain away, creating sort of a hub for waterborne diseases, increasing health risk. Again, compounding these kind of existing vulnerabilities that are there. From a gender perspective, we've already heard climate change is not gender neutral, it's disproportionately affecting women across the globe. And that's no different in informal settlements. There is existing research that shows that there are gendered impacts within informal settlements. So, for example, a study in Lusaka in Zambia discovered that during flooding, women were at higher risk of waterborne diseases because there was a gendered expectation that women would clear the floodwaters from homes, okay, which men did not do. It's important to note at this point that women here are not a homogenous group, not within the Global South, not within informal settlements. Women experience context-specific challenges wherever they are, and these are influenced by social and economic norms, cultural norms, and power relations within which they exist. But women also act with agency within this framework, and I think it's really important to understand that, and I think there's a real gap in the literature, particularly where you're looking at informal settlements, as to how women deal with adaptation challenges with agency. So I've briefly touched on the case study, and I'll come back to the governance point in a second. So this research, the proposed case study is Dhaka in Bangladesh, which you can see on this map. Dhaka is centrally located in Bangladesh. It's the fourth largest megacity in the world. It has a population of over 23 million, and that population is growing and is predicted to continue to grow over the next decades. It has a high population density. Bangladesh as a country is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It's ranked the 7th most disaster risk-prone country in the world by the Global Climate Risk Index. And Dhaka is seeing impacts such as extreme heat, intense rainfall and flooding. There are several informal settlements in Dakar, particularly in the east of the city, and these are largely concentrated in these high-risk areas from the impacts of climate change, so low-lying areas and floodplains. And existing research has highlighted that there are gendered impacts within these informal settlements within Dakar, so it's a good case study for this proposed research. So as well as looking at women and their adaptation challenges within informal settlements, it also wants to look at decision-making spaces. Now, this is a very oversimplified diagram concerning climate governance, but really the point of this is to show that adaptation strategies are formulated at a variety of levels: international, national, local, community, and below that, household and individual. And they're also formulated across a whole variety of different spaces. So by formal spaces, I mean kind of your traditional government institutions, your government agencies, and these are often divided into closed spaces where there's no widened participation, elites make decisions behind closed doors, and also invited spaces where there is some level of participation, but it's boundaried by invitation only. Contrast these to informal spaces which have grown up, which are more grassroots, and where participants create spaces for themselves with a shared common interest, goal, or identity. And spaces often exist somewhere in this continuum, formal and informal. It's not always easy to categorise them like this. But the point of this slide is really to show that these adaptation strategies grow up across a whole different set of spaces and arenas. Decision-making spaces sounds quite grand, but it means anything from a community-based organisation to a couple of people getting together to work out how to stop their properties from flooding. So really, I want to look at what spaces exist within this case study community. How are they supporting women? Are these strategies that are proposed within them gender responsive? There's a lot of talk about integration from the IPCC, integration of different spaces, of different actors across civil society working together. And that, I think, would be the dream, which is the integration sort of thread of this research. The challenge for informal settlements is that in their very nature, they are informal. Therefore, they sit outside this formal policy arena and often aren't included in the formal policy space. So how you get that integration that is suggested for these effective adaptation strategies is a real query and a quandary. So this really wants to look at the spaces that exist and how they can be integrated. Can they be integrated? How does that work? So it comes up with a research aim of investigating how formal and informal decision-making spaces can be integrated, if they can be in this scenario, to produce gender-effective adaptation policy. And I don't want you to go through these in detail, but I just wanted to highlight that really it's looking at what exists, how are they gendered, how are women represented, and how do we take these sort of role of agency into account? How can they be promoted? It's a very brief conceptual framework. I think the key in terms of these spaces and this integration is looking at space, power, and integration. Integration within spaces and integration between spaces, and then applying a gender lens is kind of the outline at the moment. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to really briefly touch on this. The plan is for primary fieldwork to be carried out in June and in December, looking at semi-structured interviews with community leaders, anybody involved in these kind of particularly informal type spaces that promote adaptation and considering those through a gender lens. And then also some focus groups with community members, because I think the community experience here is really important, and that's really key to this research. And then that's going to be supported by secondary data analysis of formal policy documents that exist to provide the formal policy framing really around this. And that's it. Thank you so much.